Chapter 10: Settler Colonialism and Disinheriting the Palestinians. The appropriation of Palestinian place names by the Israeli state. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far greater import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Palestine Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. Arthur James Balfour, cited in Nutting 2013. Zionist settler colonialism is at the heart of the conflict in Palestine. Settler colonialism is a structure, not an episode. Wolf 2006. Zionist settler colonialism is deeply rooted in European colonialism. Ignoring the existence and rights of indigenous peoples, British colonialists often saw large parts of the earth as terra nullius, nobody's land. This originally Roman legal expression was used to describe territory which was not subject to the sovereignty of any European state. Sovereignty over territory which is terra nullius may be acquired through occupation and/or settler colonization. When in the late 19th century European Zionism nationalism arose as a political force calling for the settler colonization of Palestine and their gathering of all Jews, little attention was paid to the fact that Palestine was already populated. Indeed, the Basel program adopted at the First Zionist Congress, which launched political Zionism in 1897, made no mention of a Palestinian indigenous population when it spelled out the movement's objective: the establishment of a publicly and legally secured home in Palestine for the Jewish people. Moreover, in the early years of their efforts to secure support for their enterprise, the Zionists propagated in the West the racist myth of a land without a people for a people without a land, a slogan popularized by Israel Zangwill, a prominent Anglo-Jewish writer often quoted in the British press as a spokesman for Zionism and one of the earliest organizers of the Zionist movement in Britain. Even as late as 1914, Chaim Weizmann, who was to become the first president of Israel and who, along with Theodore Herzl and David Ben-Gurion, was one of the three men most responsible for turning the Zionist dream into reality, stated, in its initial stage, Zionism was conceived by its pioneers as a movement wholly depending on mechanical factors. There is a country which happens to be called Palestine, a country without a people, and, on the other hand, there exists the Jewish people, and it has no country. What else is necessary, then, than to fit the gem into the ring, to unite this people with this country? The owners of the country, the Turks, must, therefore, be persuaded and convinced that this marriage is advantageous, not only for the Jewish people and for the country, but also for themselves. Point 1. Neither Zangwill nor Weizmann intended these demographic assessments in a literal fashion. They did not mean that there were no people in Palestine, but that there were no people worth considering within the framework of the notions of racist European supremacy that then held sway. In this connection, a comment by Weizmann to Arthur Rupan, the head of the colonization department of the Jewish Agency, is particularly revealing. When asked by Rupan about the indigenous Palestinian Arabs, Weizmann replied, "The British told us that there are some 100,000 niggers, Hebrew, Cushim, Negroes, and for those there is no value." 2. In the English language, the word nigger is a white racist slur directed at black and African people. Its derogatory connotations echo another pejorative English word, Philistine, which White Britain borrowed from biblical prejudices and popularized in daily parlance. However, in the white, racist colonial culture within which Weizmann and company operated, their reference to the indigenous people of Palestine as nigger would have been instinctive and natural. Echoing Weizmann's demographic racism and Shaftesbury's biblical Orientalism, Zangwill himself spelled out the actual meaning of his slogan with admirable clarity in 1920. If Lord Shaftesbury was literally inexact in describing Palestine as a country without a people, he was essentially correct, for there is no Arab people living in intimate fusion with the country, utilizing its resources and stamping it with a characteristic impress. There is at best an Arab encampment. Zangwill 1920, 104, see also Camel 2015. The interplay between British domestic and imperial considerations, Jewish Zionist lobbyists, especially Chaim Weizmann, 1874-1952, and Christian Zionist prophetic politics would lead to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Anderson, I. 2005, 1. 57-58. Then an imperial world power, Britain gave sanction for the first time to the Zionist campaign for possession of Palestine. This highly controversial document, dated the 2nd of November, was issued by Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour, later Lord Balfour, in the form of a letter to a prominent British Jewish supporter of the Zionist movement, Lionel Walter, Lord Rothschild, declaring British support for political Zionism. Her Majesty's government views would favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Quoted in said 1983, although the Zionist Jewish movement had already initiated a series of international congresses and established small Jewish colonies in the early 20th century Palestine, it was the sponsorship of Zionism by the leading imperial power of the age that would transform the Zionist project into a major European settler-colonial project in Palestine. Balfour's legacy became inseparable from the pro-Zionist declaration he issued in 1917. The reasons for the declaration were complex. Balfour's brand of Christian Zionism was driven by a great deal of Judeophobia, hyped perceptions of a Zionist Jewish power, and of fears of mass immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe to Britain. As Prime Minister, Balfour had passed the 1905 Aliens Act, the main object of which was to restrict the entry into Britain of Jews from Eastern Europe. Brian Clough put it rather skeptically: keeping Jews out of Britain and packing them off to Palestine were just two sides of the same anti-Semitic coin. Point 3 here: Zionist historians often chose to ignore the distinction between drivers, motives and justification, and seize upon Balfour's own post-war Christian Zionist rhetoric to justify his declaration. Yet Balfour's strategic and nationalist domestic motives and concerns, especially his well-documented efforts and policies to stop the influx of Eastern European Jewry into the UK, must be taken into consideration in any attempt to assess the motives behind the declaration, as well as the long-term catastrophic consequences for Palestine of that Balfour commitment. The religio-political roots of this British pro-Zionist commitment go all the way back to the Protestant Christian Zionist lobby, which was established in London in the 1830s by Lord Shaftesbury, Anthony Ashley Cooper, 1801–1885. Shaftesbury came from the British aristocratic ruling elite and was for decades at the heart of the Victorian establishment. He also became well known for advocating socially reformist policies at the height of the Victorian era. Shaftesbury was a Tory member of the Commons and later a member of the Lords, the upper house of Parliament in the United Kingdom. He was the nephew-in-law of Lord Melbourne, Prime Minister through most of the period from 1834 to 1841, and the stepson-in-law of Lord Palmerston, Foreign Minister for most of the 1840s and early 1850s, and then Prime Minister for most of the period 1855–1865, Merkley 1998. 13. Palmerston, 1784 to 1865, served twice as Prime Minister in the mid-19th century. For most of 1830 to 1865 he dominated British foreign policy when Britain was at the height of its imperialist power. Shaftesbury was offered positions of power by successive British governments. Palmerston encouraged and financially supported him, and both men were instrumental in the establishment of the British consulate in Jerusalem in 1838, a consulate which in the 19th century was dominated by Christian Zionists and was at the centre of British imperial schemes which led to the Balfour policy in Palestine. Scholch 1992. In particular, crusading Protestant Christian Zionist Shaftesbury was the most ardent propagator and lobbyist of the restoration of God's ancient people, as he styled the Jews. Tuchman 1982. He and the influential circle he dominated were under the influence of their end-of-times prophetic politics, evangelizing politics based on the Old Testament's Book of Daniel, which they believed would be fulfilled by their literal return and a restoration of the Jews to Palestine. As the demise of the Ottoman Empire appeared to be approaching, the Protestant advocacy of Jewish restorationism and settled colonization of Palestine increased in the UK and was seen as highly beneficial to the expanding British Empire in the Middle East. In the mid to late 19th century, Shaftesbury led the British Christian Zionist lobby, which included establishment figures such as Lord Lindsay, Crawford 1847–71, Lord Manchester, George Eliot, Holman Hunt and Holkane, epitomizing Victorian Protestant imperialism, Bible-bashing Shaftesbury was also a myth-maker. He pushed zealously the myth of ubiquitous and perennial Jewish diaspora longing to return, and on the 4th of November 1840 he placed an advertisement in the Times, London. Restoration of the Jews. A memorandum has been addressed to the Protestant monarchs of Europe on the subject of the restoration of the Jewish people to the land of Palestine. The document in question, dictated by a peculiar conjunction of affairs in the East and other striking signs of the times, reverts to the original covenant which secures that land to the Jewish descendant of Abraham. Quoted in Wagner 1995-91, Shaftesbury was directly responsible for the propagandistic slogan, "A country without a nation for a nation without a country," for later to become a key Zionist Jewish myth. A land without a people for a people without a land. Masalha 1997, Hyamson 1950, 10, 12, Camel 2015. Assessing the significance of his lobbying efforts on the fortunes of the Protestant Zionist movement in Britain, Donald Wagner writes, "One cannot overstate the influence of Lord Shaftesbury on the British political elites, church leaders, and the average Christian layperson. His efforts and religious political thought may have set the tone for England's colonial approach to the Near East and in particular the Holy Land during the next 100 years. He singularly translated the theological positions of Brightman, Henry Finch, and John Nelson. Darby, the father of modern premillennial dispensationalism, 5 see below, 5 into a political strategy. His high political connections, matched by his uncanny instincts, combined to advance the Christian Zionist vision." Wagner 1995-92. In 1880 F. Lawrence Oliphant, 1829-1888, MP, novelist and evangelical Christian, a follower of Shaftesbury, published a book entitled The Land of Gilead, named after the biblical Land of Gilead, 6, in which he presented a plan of Jewish restoration and a detailed project for Jewish settlement east of the River Jordan. He urged the British Parliament to assist Jewish immigration from Russia and Eastern Europe to Palestine. Not surprisingly, he also advocated that indigenous Palestinian Arabs be removed to reservations like those of the indigenous inhabitants of North America. 7. Sharif 1983, 68. Or hinting at the Bantustan ideology later developed by South Africa. Sharif 1983, 68, Wagner 1995, 93. A combination of Protestant religious and imperialist considerations drove some Britons to produce Christian Zionist novels, to set up exploration societies and to advocate the restoration of the Jews to Palestine, in public and in private. 8. Furthermore, a succession of archaeological discoveries in the Near East, military adventurism and the growing number of travelogues fired the imagination of Protestant missionaries, European officials and Arabist scholars and led to the direct involvement of European powers in the Holy Land. Shepherd 1987. Osmond Shepherd 1987-1989. This European obsession with the archaeological past was marked by a decided contempt for the indigenous people of Palestine and life in modern Palestinian villages and towns at the height of the British Empire, and the Victorian-era prophetic politics of a biblical restorationism went hand in hand with increasing British colonial involvement in their Orient. The Holy Land in the 19th century was an attractive target for several European nations which were flexing their colonial muscles around the globe. The region was ready for Western penetration, particularly while the Ottoman Empire was showing signs of political and economic disintegration. The race for a European national presence and colonial commercial interests in the East, and in the Holy Land in particular, was masked by scholarly activities and Oriental studies, said 1978. Coinciding with the European scramble for Palestine, various sectors of the Western Academy and most of the Western Christian churches displayed an increasing interest in Palestine. Invariably, foreign interest took the form of establishing Christian institutions. The Ottoman reforms after the Crimean War, 1853-1856, granted equal rights, including property rights, to non-Muslims, thereby uniting Christian missionary endeavor with national influence. The interests of God and country ran in parallel. The British moved early, 9, and were soon emulated by the Russians, 10 Germans, 11 Austrians, W. Arb 1996, and others, marking the beginning of extensive Western influence in Palestine an influence which the Ottomans feared might be a prelude to attempting to recover Palestine as a Christian state. 12 Such was the degree of Western penetration that the Austrian consul, the Count of Kaboger, reported in 1880 that Jerusalem had become a European city, and Captain, later General Sir Charles Warren, 1840–1927, of the British Royal Engineers and one of the key officers of the British Palestine Exploration Fund, who was sent to map the Old Testament topography of Jerusalem and investigate the site of the temple, noted British King Consul James Finn rules supreme, not over the natives of the city, but over strangers. But yet these strangers for the most part are the rightful owners, the natives, for the most part, are usurpers. Shepherd 1987, 127–128. Protestant Zionists and British imperialists believed that a Jewish Palestine would be convenient for a British protectorate there along the main route to India. From the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, three famous British prime ministers were closely associated with Gentile Zionism in Britain: Benjamin Disraeli, 1804–1881, who was successful in securing for Imperial Britain control of the Suez Canal; David Lloyd George, 1863–1945, whose government issued the Balfour Declaration of 1917; and Sir Winston Churchill, who for nearly half a century in and out of office was devoted to political Zionism and the British Empire. Sykes 1973, 45, 52, 207. Both Disraeli and Lloyd George were fascinated by the theories of amalgamation or affinity between Christianity and Judaism. Anderson, I. 2005, 60. Lloyd George, a Protestant Zionist, was once quoted as saying, "I was taught far more history about the Jews than about the history of my own people." Quoted by Stein 1961, 142. And Disraeli was baptized a Protestant, but he remained fascinated by his Jewish background. Describing Protestant Christianity as a completed Judaism, he, like many Christian Zionists, delighted in describing himself as their missing page between the Old and New Testaments. Johnson, p. 1993. 324. Disraeli's civilizing Christian imperialism combined patronizing attitudes towards the Jews with imperialist foreign policies towards the Middle East, policies which he justified by invoking paternalistic and racist theories which saw imperialism as a manifestation of what Britain's imperial poet, Rudyard Kipling, would refer to as the white man's burden. 13. For centuries, and for more than 80 years of political Zionism, the Palestinian Arabs were an absolute majority in Palestine. Balfour was fully aware of this fact when, on the 11th of August 1919, he frankly expressed his typically colonialist views and wrote, "Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land." The idea of planting a European minority of outsiders upon an indigenous majority population, without consulting it, was not calculated to horrify men who had worked with Cecil Rhodes or promoted European settlement in Kenya. Quoted in Talman 1965, 248, 250. In 1925, Balfour visited Palestine and was a key guest of honor at the opening of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was greeted enthusiastically by the leadership of the small European Zionist Yishuv settlement in Palestine, while the majority of indigenous inhabitants of Palestine welcomed him with black flags. The key to understanding the contribution of Britain to the Palestinian Nakba catastrophe of the mid-20th century lies in the intensity with which some British Christian restorationists embraced the project of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, the way in which the Bible and the divine rights and divine promises were seen by the likes of British Prime Minister Lloyd George and his Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour, who issued the Balfour Declaration, and generally the extraordinary appeal political Zionism had in the West. Although the Balfour Declaration was partly motivated by First World War calculations, it was not issued in an ideological vacuum. Its content reflected the Christian Zionist prophetic politics which became deeply rooted in 19th century imperialist Protestant Britain. Fareed 1970. 14. This all meant that, from the beginning, the reality of Palestine and the Palestinians lay outside Western and Zionist representations of their Jewish homeland in Palestine. Furthermore, as Edward Said argued, Their site of the Zionist struggle was only partially in Palestine. The crucial site of the Zionist struggle remained until 1948 in the capital cities in the West, while the reality of Palestine and the native resistance to the Zionists was either played down or ignored in the West, said 1980. 22-23. By removing the struggle from the Middle East, the Palestinians and Arabs were prevented from representing themselves and were deemed incapable of doing so. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented, quoted in said 1980. Point 15. In making the Zionist movement attractive to Western audiences, its leaders not only denied the existence of the Arabic-speaking people of Palestine, they represented the Arabs to the West as something that could be understood and managed in specific ways. Between Zionism and the West, there was and still is a community of language and of ideology. Arabs were not part of this community. To a very great extent, this community depends on a tradition in the West of enmity towards Islam in particular and the Orient in general, said 1979, 25-26. A major success of the Christian and Jewish Zionists has been their ability to occupy the space from which they were all to represent and explain the Arabs to the West. The Zionists took it upon themselves as a partially Eastern people who had emancipated themselves from the worst Eastern excesses to explain the Oriental Arabs to the West, to assume responsibility for expressing what the Arabs were really like and about, never to let the Arabs appear equally with them as existing in Palestine. This method allowed Zionism always to seem both involved in and superior to the native realities of Middle Eastern existence, said 1980, 26. Despite such Christian and Jewish Zionist statements, however, the Zionist leaders from the outset were well aware that not only were there people on the land, but that people were there in large numbers. Zangwill, who had visited Palestine in 1897 and come face to face with the demographic reality, acknowledged in 1905 in a speech to a Zionist group in Manchester that Palestine proper has already its inhabitants. The Pashalik of Jerusalem is already twice as thickly populated as the United States, having 52 souls to the square mile, and not 25% of them Jews. Zangwill, 1937. 210. Abundant references to the Palestinian population in early Zionist texts show clearly that from the beginning of Zionist settlement in Palestine, which Zionist historiography dates to the arrival of the members of the Russian Bilu Society in 1882, the Palestinian Arabs were far from being an unseen or a hidden presence. Moreover, recent studies have shown that Zionist leaders were concerned with what they termed their Arab problem, Hebrew, Habayir Hararvit, or their Arab question, Hebrew, Hashalar Hararvit. As seen in their writings, the attitudes prevailing among the majority of the Zionist groups and settlers concerning the indigenous Palestinian population ranged from indifference and disregard to patronizing superiority. A typical example can be found in the works of Moshe Smolansky, a Zionist writer and labor leader who immigrated to Palestine in 1890. Let us not be too familiar with the Arab fellahin lest our children adopt their ways and learn from their ugly deeds. Let all those who are loyal to the Torah avoid ugliness and that which resembles it and keep their distance from the fellahin and their base attributes. There were, certainly, those who took exception to such attitudes. Ahad Haram, Asher Zvi Ginsburg, a liberal Russian Jewish thinker who visited Palestine in 1891, published a series of articles in the Hebrew periodical Hamletz that were sharply critical of the ethnocentricity of political Zionism as well as the exploitation of Palestinian peasantry by Zionist settler colonists. Ahad Haram, who sought to draw attention to the fact that Palestine was not an empty territory and that the presence of another people on the land posed problems, observed that the Zionist pioneers believed that the only language that the Arabs understand is that of force. They behave towards the Arabs with hostility and cruelty, trespass unjustly upon their boundaries, beat them shamefully without reason and even brag about it, and nobody stands to check this contemptible and dangerous tendency. Cited in Masalha 1992-7, he cut to the heart of the matter when he ventured that the colonists' aggressive attitude towards the native peasants stemmed from their anger towards those who reminded them that there is still another people in the land of Israel that have been living there and does not intend to leave. Another early settler, Yitzhak Epstein, who arrived in Palestine from Russia in 1886, warned not only of the moral implications of Zionist colonization but also of the political dangers inherent in the enterprise. In 1907, at a time when Zionist land purchases in the Galilee were stirring opposition among Palestinian peasants forced off land sold by absentee landlords, Epstein wrote a controversial article entitled "The Hidden Question," in which he strongly criticized the methods by which Zionists had purchased Arab land. In his view, these methods entailing dispossession of Arab farmers were bound to cause political confrontation in the future. Reflected in the Zionist establishment's angry response to Epstein's article are two principal features of mainstream Zionist thought: the belief that Jewish acquisition of land took precedence over moral considerations, and the advocacy of a separatist and exclusionist Yishuv colony in Palestine. Following in the footsteps of European settler colonialists before the First World War, some Zionist leaders, notably Theodor Herzl in his Zionist novel Alt Neuland, conceived the reality of Palestine and the material benefits European Jewish colonization would bring to Palestine to be similar to the supremacist ideology of their white man's burden. During the mandatory period, however, it became clear to the Zionist leadership that a systematic dislocation and a transfer of the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine was the conditio sine qua non of the Zionist enterprise. Weimer 1983, 26, Masalha 1992. In his seminal work, Orientalism, 1978, Edward W. Said subjected Western, Oriental studies to a devastating critique and exposed the underlying presumptions of the discipline. He also concluded that biblical studies were part of and an extension of the Western Orientalist discourse, which had been constructed without any Oriental, Arab, Muslim reader in view. For said, in this biblical Orientalist discourse, the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine were presented as incapable of unified action and national consciousness. The biblical scholars, following in the footsteps of the Western Orientalists, concentrated on historical and archaeological questions. In The Question of Palestine, which came out 2 years after Orientalism, Said also tried to explain the erasure of Palestinians from history. For him, the deletion of the reality of Palestine centered on three key issues. First, understanding the representation of Palestine, the Palestinians, and Islam in the West. Said's book covering Islam, 1981, should be treated as part of a trilogy which includes Orientalism, 1978, and The Question of Palestine, Said 1980, Ashcroft and Ahluwalia 2001, 125. For Said, the representations of Islam in the West are an important part of the question of Palestine because they are used to silence the Palestinians, the majority of whom are Muslims. Said 1980, Ashcroft and Ahluwalia 2001, 128. Second, understanding their contest between an affirmation and a denial. Third, understanding Western Orientalist attitudes towards Arabs and Islam, Western racial prejudices, and especially the Western narrative of a contest between their civilizing forces, of the Zionist European settlers and their uncivilized, treacherous, and degenerate Oriental Arabs. Said 1980, 25-28. This biblically framed discourse entails a. The shaping of history, so that this history now appears to confirm the validity of Zionist claims to Palestine, thereby denigrating Palestinians' claims. Said 1988. And b. The Zionist legitimization of Zionist settler colonization in Palestine, a process that did not end with the creation of Israel in 1948. Hebrewisation, antecedents to Zionist toponymy. The reinvention of both the Jewish past and modern Jewish nationhood in Zionist historiography and the creation of a modern Hebrew nationalist consciousness have received some scholarly attention. Myers 1995, Ramius 1995-1995, 91-124, Pitterberg 2001, Raskrokotskin 1993, 1994. Toponymic and remapping projects were also deployed extensively and destructively by the European colonial powers and European settler colonial movements. In Palestine, the Zionist Hebrew renaming projects were critical to the ethnicization of the European Jews and nationalization of the Hebrew Bible. These projects were inspired by and followed closely British, French and American archaeological and geographical expeditions of the second half of the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. In line with the reinventions of European ethno-romantic nationalisms, Zionist ideological archaeology and geography claimed to own an exclusive national inheritance in Palestine. The land of Israel was invented and treated as a matter of exclusive ownership. This process of ethno-nationalization and reinvention of the past intensified after the establishment of the Israeli state in 1948 as part of the general attempt to ethno-nationalize both Jews and the Hebrew Bible. Rapkin 2010. 130. Since the rise of the Zionist settler movement in the late 19th century, and especially since the establishment of Israel in 1948, the struggle over toponymic memory and the renaming of sites has developed as an integral part of the political conflict in Palestine. The indigenous Palestinians have insisted on their own comprehensive set of Arabic place names through which they see their own social memory and deep-rootedness in the land of Palestine. On the other hand, since the ethnic cleansing of the 1948 Nakba and the creation of the Israeli state, a large number of Palestinian Arabic place names have been Judaized, Hebraicized. Indeed, since 1948 the Israeli army and Israeli state have sought systematically to replace Palestinian Arabic place names, claiming priority in chronology and using modern archaeology, map-making and place names as their proofs of Jewish roots in the land of Israel. In Israel, the significance of place names lies in their potential to legitimize historical claims asserted by the Zionist settler colonial movement. In her book Bible and Sword, How the British Came to Palestine, 1982, Barbara Tuchman shows how the two magnets, the Bible and the sword, have drawn countless British pilgrims, crusaders, missionaries, biblical archaeologists and conquerors of Palestine and ultimately led to the British conquest of Palestine in 1918. Central to this book is the assertion that the land conquest narrative of the Bible has been the key text that redeems the European settler colonization of Palestine. Outside the Middle East, the Bible has redeemed European empires and European settler colonialism, the conquest of the earth and even current American imperialism. As a fact of power, the authority of the biblical narrative has also been central to organized religion and collective memory. As organized memory, the authority of the Bible became critical to the political theologies of the medieval Latin crusaders, Spanish conquistadors, in the struggle for colonial power in Latin America from 1492 until the 20th century, and a whole variety of settler colonist projects. In fact, in modern times a range of Western settler colonial enterprises have deployed the power politics of the biblical text and its famous land conquest narrative very effectively and with devastating consequences for indigenous peoples. The narrative of Exodus has been widely deployed as a framing narrative for European settler colonialism and the European mission civilizatrice, while other biblical texts have been appropriated and used to provide moral authority for European exploration in and settler colonial conquests of Africa, Asia, Australia and the Americas, prior 1997, 1999. From Qam ul-Khalili to Kerem Avram, 1855 James Finn's colony. In the early modern period, Palestinian place names contributed to the rise of biblical criticism. In the 17th century, the rationalist Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza of Amsterdam initiated a critical approach to scriptural studies by looking at place names in Palestine and the Bible. Using toponyms from Palestine as well as other arguments, he concluded that, contrary to the standard belief among Jews and Christians, Moses did not write the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Palestinian place names attracted the attention of fundamentalist Christians and European imperialists in the 19th century. Toponymic projects and geographical replacing of place names in Palestine became powerful tools in the hands of the European powers which competed to penetrate the land of the Bible. The British were the first to recognize and exploit the power of state-sponsored explorations and began to link Scriptural geography with the restorationist schemes, excavations and colonial penetration of Palestine. The first British colony of Kerem of Rum, Abraham Vineyard, began as a small settlement founded in 1855 by the influential British consul in Jerusalem James Finn and his wife Elizabeth Ann Finn, the daughter of a noted English Hebrew scholar and herself a Hebrew speaker. James Finn, who served in Ottoman Jerusalem from 1846 to 1863, reigned supreme in the city, and he became a central figure in the mid-19th century European penetration of Palestine. He also combined his British diplomatic job with Christian missionary activities. His activities paved the way for the biblical explorations and military mapping of Palestine by officers of the British Royal Engineering Corps on behalf of the London-based Palestine Exploration Fund. James Finn combined biblical restorationist ideology and missionary activities with official British civil service. He and his wife Elizabeth were originally members of the London Society for Promoting Christianity amongst the Jews. Also, crucially, he was a close associate of Anthony Ashley Cooper, 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, a prominent Tory MP, a millennialist Protestant and a key contributor to Victorian Protestant Zionist Restorationism, who invented the myth, a land without people, for a people without a land. In the early 1850s, Finn had purchased Qam al-Khalili, Arabic for Al-Khalili Vineyard, from a local Palestinian for £250. Al-Khalil is the indigenous Palestinian Arabic toponym for the biblical city of Hebron, a city which both local Palestinian Muslim and biblical traditions link to the patriarch Ibrahim al-Khalil, Abraham. Thus Finn used an indigenous name to link firmly the toponym of the modern colony in Jerusalem to biblical traditions. After the 1967 conquests, the Israeli state was bound to base its conception of Jerusalem upon a mythologized entity, Jerusalem of gold, and to invoke abstract historical and ideological rights in the newly acquired territories, as well as resting its claim on territorial expansion and domination and the redemption of land through settler colonization. The same process of appropriation and erasure of Palestinian heritage and the superimposition of a Zionist Hebrew colonizing toponymy on Palestinian sites continued after 1967. Almost immediately after the conquest of East Jerusalem, the Palestine Archaeological Museum, which represented the multicultural identity and shared heritage of Palestine, was renamed the Rockefeller Museum. Some items were taken to the Shrine of the Book, Hebrew, Heikel HaSefer, a wing of the Israel Museum in West Jerusalem, which houses parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in 1947-1956 in the Qumran Caves. The Palestine Archaeological Museum had been located on Qam al-Sheikhi, their vineyard, of Sheikh al-Khalili, a hill just outside the northeastern corner of the Old City. The museum had been conceived and established during the Mandatory period, with financial support from the Rockefeller family. It was opened to the public in January 1938. The museum housed a large collection of artifacts unearthed in the excavations conducted in Palestine in 1890-1948. Also among the museum's prized possessions were historical artifacts from the Al-Aqsa Mosque and 12th century Crusader period marble lintels from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Until 1966, the museum was run by an international board of trustees. It was then taken over by the Jordanian state. Since 1967, the museum has been jointly managed by the Israel Museum and the Israel Department of Antiquities and Museums, later renamed Israel Antiquities Authority. The site is now the headquarters of the Israel Antiquity Authorities, while the Palestine Archaeological Museum of the Mandatory period still represented the positive diversity of religions and ethnicities that characterized Jerusalem and Palestine for many centuries. The Israel Museum and Shrine of the Book represent the single-minded determination by the Israel Antiquities Authority and Israel's heritage industry to Judaize and colonize both the ancient and modern histories of Palestine, disappearing Palestinian villages and place names before 1948. During the pre-state period, the Zionist Yishuv in Palestine developed four key strategies: the widespread use of the term Palestine in tandem with Eretz Israel in Zionism, late 19th century until 1948, appropriation of Arab names, hybridization of names of Jewish settlements and indigenization of the settlers, instrumentalization of the myth narratives of the Bible, and a restorationist biblical archaeology, Hebraization and Biblicization of Palestinian Arabic toponyms. Utilization of the toponymic lists of the Palestine Exploration Fund and the works of Western biblical archaeologists. Appropriation of Arabic place names, indigenization of the European settlers and hybridization strategies. Subterfuge and the widespread use of the term Palestine in combination with Eretz Israel in Zionism, late 19th century until 1948. The multicultural identity and diversity of Palestine was always in sharp contrast to the anachronism of monocultural Zionism, a latecomer European settler colonial movement. A monoculturalist ideology inspired by racialized and romantic 19th century European nationalism, Zionism originated in Central and Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th century. Therefore, it is hardly surprising that from its beginning in the late 19th century and until the creation of Israel in 1948, the Zionist leadership and institutions themselves frequently used the term Palestine in their official discourse and publications. This practice was in common with European and British official designation of the country as Palestine. However, during the mandatory period, the Zionists often employed this term Palestine in tandem with their imaginary construct of Eretz Israel, while, as I show in my 1992 work Expulsion of the Palestinians, the concept of transfer in Zionist political thought, 1982-1948, simultaneously planning to dismantle Palestine and ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. Masalha 1992. Furthermore, the Zionist transfer and ethnic cleansing strategies and toponymicidal practices sought to replace the heterogeneity and mixed space of Palestine with a pure European colony, an Ashkenazi-dominated, monocultural space of the Zionist Yishuv until 1948. Kimmeling 2003. In a microcosmic and typical fashion, the heterogeneity of the thousands of years old Jaffa was ethnically cleansed and culturally destroyed in 1948. This historic, culturally mixed Palestinian city was replaced after 1948 and subsumed by the European, pure, Jewish city of neighboring Tel Aviv, the capital of the pre-state Yishuv colony, subsumed and subordinated ancient Jaffa under the post-1948 Hebrew designation of Tel Aviv-Yaffo. This Zionist memoricidal and toponymicidal project was institutionally, cognitively, and emotionally built within an exclusionary Jewish bubble. The plans for the new Jewish state were similarly exclusive. The Jewish state was supposed to be purely Jewish, and no political and bureaucratic tools were prepared for the possibility, mentioned in all partition proposals, that large Arab minorities would remain within the boundaries of the Jewish state. Kimmeling 2003, 22, see also Yiftashel 2006, 54, Schaffer 1996a, 1996b, 1999. During the mandatory period, the Zionist organizations in Palestine employed a variety of methods of subterfuge designed to conflate Palestine with Eretz Israel. One such example of concealment and subterfuge was the insertion of the Hebrew abbreviation of Eretz Israel, Land of Israel, after the Hebrew word for Palestine, on the official mandatory government stamps which would have been handled by tens of thousands of Arabs in Palestine and neighboring countries, most of them not knowing Hebrew and unable to decipher the Zionist Hebrew abbreviation. Although Palestinian leaders protested in the 1920s at this inclusion of Eretz Israel in the official documents, stamps and currency of the British Mandatory Government of Palestine, a government which was committed to the pro-Zionist promise of the 1917 Balfour Declaration, they were incapable of dissuading the mandatory authorities from pursuing their pro-Zionist policies. However, the extensive use of the official term Palestine by the Zionist organizations until 1948 is not surprising for two main reasons. All governments and millions of people across the world, and especially readers of European languages, identified the country as Palestine or the Holy Land. The only exceptions were the Zionist Jewish advocates, who also identified the country as Eretz Israel, Land of Israel, following the pro-Zionist Balfour Declaration commitments of November 1917. The Zionist settler colony in Palestine, the Yishuv, evolved both as a settler colonialism within British colonialism and as a settler colony with British colonialism. This allowed the emerging European Yishuv to pursue a double strategy of a shadowing and operating from within the official terminology of British mandatory system in Palestine, and b. of creating a parallel autonomous Zionist Hebrew discourse. Nonetheless, subterfuge of Palestine Eretz Israel, euphemism, transfer, alternative facts, and new facts on the ground were central to the newspeak and strategies of the Zionist colony, Yishuv, in Palestine during the pre-state period, and this is evident from the following examples. The Society for the Support of Jewish Farmers and Artisans in Syria and Palestine was a Hovevei Zion organ established in 1890 with official support and encouragement of the Tsarist Russian government. Shafar 1996a. 46. The society was dedicated to the practical aspects of establishing Jewish agricultural colonies in Palestine, and its projects included help with the founding of the colonies of Rehovot and Hadira. The Jewish Agency for Palestine was founded in 1930 and played a central role in the founding of the Israeli state in 1948. The chairman of its executive committee from 1935 until May 1948 was David Ben-Gurion. Only after 1948 did it change its name to the Jewish Agency for Israel. The Palestine Office, German, Palestinamt, was the name of a Zionist agency set up by the executive of the World Zionist Organization in 1908 with its office in Jaffa. Headed by Arthur Rupan, born in the German Empire, 1876 to 1943, the Palestine Office served during the Ottoman period as the central agency for Zionist colonization activities in Palestine, including land purchases and assisting Jewish immigration. After the First World War, the Zionist name Palestine offices had a different connotation and applied to Zionist international missions charged with the mobilization and organization of Jewish immigration to Palestine. The Palestine offices were subordinated to the Immigration Department of the Zionist Executive, which worked with the Jewish Agency for Palestine. The Palestine offices were run by a Palestine Commission, Palestinamt Commission, composed of representatives of various Zionist parties. The Palestine Orchestra, Israel Philharmonic Orchestra, founded in Palestine 1936 and was continuously called the Palestine Orchestra until 1948. The Anglo-Palestine Bank, Israel's largest bank, Bank Leumi, National Bank, was originally founded in London as the Anglo-Palestine Company. It was a subsidiary of the Jewish Colonial Trust, which was founded by the Second Zionist Congress and incorporated in London in 1899. It subsequently became officially known as the Anglo-Palestine Bank, and this name continued until 1948. The Palestine Electric Company was initially founded in 1923 by Piers Rothenberg as the Jaffa Electric Company. It was later incorporated in Mandatory Palestine as the Palestine Electricity Corporation Limited. It only changed its name to the current one, the Israel Electric Corporation Limited, in 1961. Today it is one of the largest industrial companies in Israel. The Palestine Post was established in Jerusalem in 1932 as part of the Zionist movement and only changed its name in 1950 to the Jerusalem Post. The newspaper's targeted audiences were English readers in Palestine and neighboring countries and Jewish readers abroad, British mandate officials, local Jews and Arabs, tourists and Christian pilgrims. Zionist organizations considered the Jerusalem Post an effective medium for exerting influence on the British authorities in Palestine. During its first year, the Palestine Post achieved a daily circulation of about 4,000 copies, and by 1944 its circulation reached 50,000 copies. 16. The Jewish Palestine Exploration Society was founded in 1914 with a focus on ancient Palestine. It was renamed after 1948 as the Israel Exploration Society. The Palestine Football Association was established in 1928 by Zionist Jewish football clubs. After 1948, it was renamed the Israel Football Association. The Palestine Potash Company was established in 1930. In 1951, the company was nationalized by the Israeli government, and in 1953 it was renamed the Dead Sea Works. Palestine Citrograph, a monthly journal devoted to the citrus industry in Palestine, was published in Tel Aviv in the 1930s and 1940s by the Zionist Yishuv. The name was later changed to the Hebrew Hadar. The Palestine Economic Corporation, now the Israel Economic Corporation, was founded by American Zionist investors in 1922 as a public company and incorporated in the U.S. Initially it invested and operated through another American Zionist organization, the Central Bank of Cooperative Institutions in Palestine, and a string of Zionist, Palestine, subsidiary companies including the Palestine Mortgage and Credit Bank Limited and the Palestine Water Company. The Palestine Water Company itself became a subsidiary of the Palestine Economic Corporation in 1933, and in 1949 it was renamed Mikrot, the Israeli Water Company, a division of the Histadrut. Palestine Endowment Funds was created in 1922 by U.S. Zionist leaders to enable the distribution of funds to selected and approved Zionist organizations in Palestine. Many years after Israel was established, it was renamed Israel Endowment Funds. Its grants now total over $1 billion. The Palestine Automobile Corporation Limited was founded in 1934 and began its activities as a Chevrolet dealer for Tel Aviv and Haifa. In 1937, the company took over the sole distributorship of Ford products, marketing Ford cars and commercial vehicles manufactured in the US and in Europe. The company continued to operate under their Palestine name for several years after the establishment of Israel. Flora Palestina is a publication by the Israeli Academy of Sciences and Humanities, first appeared in 1966. It encompasses the Palestina plant taxonomic and floristic data in the geobotanical area between the Mediterranean coast in the west and the Transjordan deserts in the east, the mountains of Lebanon in the north and the desert of Sinai in the south. An updated version, Distribution Atlas of Plants in the Flora Palestina Area by A. Danin, was published in 2004. Appropriation, hybridization and indigenization, the appropriation of Palestine place names by European Zionist settlers. From Malul to Nalal, Palestinian place names began to be replaced by biblical and Hebrew-sounding names during the late Ottoman and mandatory periods, and small Palestinian villages began to disappear from the map, although local Palestinians continued to use the indigenous names for the new Zionist colonies. These practices of a reclaiming by renaming, while displacing the indigenous names, were pivotal to the colonization of the land of Palestine, and as a language of creating an authentic collective Zionist Hebrew identity rooted in their land of the Bible, referring candidly to the gradual replacement of Arabic place names and of Palestinian villages by Hebrew place names and Jewish settlements. During the mandatory period, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, the author of Living with the Hebrew Bible, 1978, had this to say in an address in April 1969 to students at the Technion, Israel's prestigious Institute of Technology in Haifa. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of these villages, and I do not blame you because geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. Nalal arose in the place of Malul, Kibbutz Gvat in the place of Jibter, Kibbutz Sarid in the place of Hunafis, and Kefar Yehoshua in the place of Tal al-Shuman. There is not a single place built in this country that didn't have a former Arab population. 17. Dayan, 1915 to 1981, who spoke Arabic, considered himself and was considered by his fellow European settlers as a typical Sabra. He was born in Kibbutz Degay near Aleph in Palestine before his parents moved to Nalal, founded in 1921. His father Shmuel Kategorodski, who served in the first 3 sessions of the Israeli Knesset, was born in Zheshkov, modern-day Ukraine, immigrated to Palestine in 1908 and Hebraicized his name to Dayan, Hebrew for a judge in Jewish religious courts. According to Zionist propaganda, the name Nalal derived from a biblical village, Joshua 19 verse 15. Yet Moshe Dayan knew and was prepared to acknowledge publicly that the name of his own settlement, Morshav, Nalal, was in fact a Hebrew rendering of the name of the Palestinian Arabic village name it had replaced, Malul, however, to give it a biblical authenticity.